Wonderful. Thank you, Francis, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Apologies, I have a lurgy, so I'm going to sound a bit hoarse, and I'm not very good at sharing my slides, so Tom's going to do it for me. So thank you. So I'm going to talk about the findings of a project funded by the Co-Production Collective on research with people outside of the university system and research ethics. And I've called this "Is research ethics a state of doing or being?" And I'm just going to share the results of our project and some reflections. And I just wanted to say first a quick word about definitions. So the Co-Production Collective, who are based at UCL in London, defines co-production as working in equal partnership for equal benefit. And patient and public involvement, or PPI for short, is research being done with people, not for them. So I live in the UK, and that is the context in which our project was set. And I understand that the context may be different from members of the audience, but I would hope that the values and principles undermining research ethics are pretty much universal. Next slide, please, Tom. So first, why have I put up this slide? So I wanted to be explicit about my positionality perspective, as I understand how that impacts on what I am going to talk about. So I live with a rare disease and multiple long-term conditions. And as Francis has said, I'm involved across the UK with multiple researchers, academic institutions and organisations. And I've also worked as a patient or peer researcher, co-producing research. And that means that I see issues firmly through the lens of my patient, participant and involvement experience, because I participate in research as well. And the question I want to ask is reflexivity, which is examining and attempting to understand how one's own beliefs, judgments and practices affect and influence the research process, crucial for the research ethics process. And that might be something that we could have a chat about later. Next slide, please. So this is the project team that undertook the work that I'm going to talk about. And as you can see, I worked with Helen Craig, who was the public engagement manager at UCL, and Jade and Emily, and I my role was as a patient and public contributor because I'm a member of the Co-Production Collective. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I feel I need to mention the context for this project before I start. So we talked to people about the university research ethics process, not the Health Research Authority, the HRA, which governs research ethics in the UK. And the Declaration of Helsinki, which Mary talked about, which is codified in ethics guidance by multiple countries, is clear that pure research ethics is about protecting the rights and autonomy of people, of participants in research. And the HRA stance in the UK is the same. But as you will see, as I talk about our project, university research ethics committees have a different view. And I acknowledge at this point that there are ethical issues in co-producing and involving people in research, which we will doubtless discuss, but these are different to what I'm calling pure research ethics. So why did we do this project? So we believe that researchers and professional services staff at University College London were unclear on the ethical dimensions of their work with partners outside of academia, especially formal research ethics. And we wanted to discover the scale of the problem through internal stakeholder interviews. And at first, what we wanted to do was develop and approve a guide and toolkit for deciding when work needs to go through the ethical process and create this firm base for people to build their projects on. And we felt that this would help researchers and professional staff engage with those outside academia, like myself, in ways which are ethical, appropriate, and mutually benefit. Next slide, please. So this is what we did. So we had 50 conversations with internal and external experts, but we changed the focus of what we did. So in the beginning, we were just going to speak to people in UCL. We talked to people outside UCL. We dropped the principles and framework for reasons that will become clear, and we wrote a project report and guidance with 2 case studies, and I will try and post them in the chat when I finish. Next slide, please. So what were our findings? So we identified 4 key learning points, the first of which was responsibility. And we felt that ethics was everyone's responsibility and shouldn't be siphoned off to academic research teams and ethic advisory boards. And the consideration of ethical practice didn't stop with ethical approval or what people commonly talk about, getting ethics. And although people appreciated the ethics review process, this was seen as not always the best or the only option, because we felt that ethical behaviour was important as an informed choice, and we shouldn't just view it as yet another thing to do as part of the research process. And in the conversations we had with very experienced public contributors, it became apparent that actually very few of them had contributed to the ethics approval process. But on some occasions, they had been asked to get involved if there were issues with gaining approval and write letters to the ethics committees. Next slide, please. Processes. So there was a suggestion that there needs to be a process to revisit ethical issues throughout projects, including specific pathways for public contributors and co-producers. And this may include naming an independent person who isn't part of the research team for people to contact. And people mentioned the value of creating time and space to reflect and discuss ethical issues for everyone in research. And I would ask, do you think we do this currently? And we were given the example of a PhD student who was looking forward to discussing the ethics of their research with the committee, but was told there was no time for that, and that wasn't what the ethics committee was there for. So I would ask, actually, where do we have these conversations? And do we feel that they're important? And, you know, this led us to thinking that actually current research ethics processes can be seen as unsuitable for public involvement and engagement, non-inclusive for public contributors, and quite frankly, a tick box exercise. Next slide, please. Inconsistency. So due to the conflation between research and public involvement or engagement, inconsistent decisions are being made about the need for formal research ethics approvals for projects. And this was felt to be partly due to the lack of understanding of the definitions between research, public involvement and engagement, co-production and co-production, and they were often conflated with participation. And I compare the situation with the Wild West. Individual research ethics committees make these decisions and do what they want. And we found that different ethics committees in the same academic institution had a different view on this. So actually it was really confusing for people. And this was unlike the HRA, for example, who were quite clear that the patient public involvement and co-production is not participation. So people told us that more clarity was needed on multiple issues. And this inconsistency led to people, again, getting ethics just in case. And someone described that as like house insurance. You get it because you might need it. So my question is, does this promote ethical thinking? Is this really what the ethics process should be about? Next slide, please. And power. And, you know, involving public contributors in the ethics process helps to ensure that research will be considered ethically acceptable to the people who will be taking part. Public contributors are involved because of their lived experience, and like me, a lot of us are involved as a public contributor, but also participate in research. And we felt that equitable treatment and power sharing are key to collaboration at this stage. And this led us to ask, do research ethics committees acknowledge and consider potential power imbalances between researchers, public contributors, and co-producers? Who should sit on research ethics committees and make decisions? Who decides how committees should operate and whether patient public involvement and co-production require ethical approval? Next slide, please. So this slide is just a recap of some of our findings, but I thought it might be useful to mention some other issues that were raised. And training was often mentioned by the people we spoke to. Very few people we spoke to had been offered any training in research ethics or supported to develop as ethical thinkers. And people had an experience of issues around GDPR, for example, which we've talked about, which are important, being dealt with in research ethics committees. And so I would ask, do people think these are research ethics issues? Next slide, please. And, you know, many describe the current research ethics process as opaque, with limited opportunity to become involved. And we need to find a common language so that the co-production world and the involvement world and the research ethics world can converse. Because actually, I'm not sure that we're doing that at the moment. Next slide, please. So just some more next steps. So publishing was something that came up in conversations a lot. So we heard that the research teams applied for ethical approval just in case journals required it for PPI and co-production projects. So we need an open dialogue with journals as well, via the conflation of participation and involvement. And I have my own experience of being part of a PPI group who submitted a paper on our experiences in a project, and we weren't allowed to quote ourselves because we didn't have ethics to do so, which is just crazy. Sorry, I just don't understand that. And there was also, and we've talked a bit about vulnerability as well, but there was also some issues around the question of vulnerability being assigned to ethics committees, to co-producers, which caused deep offence and upset. And if topics are sensitive, then surely they can affect the whole team, not just the co-producers. And if people that are involved in research were felt to require mental health support, well then actually, if it's an upsetting topic, shouldn't that be made available to the whole team? You know, who decides who is vulnerable? Next slide, please. So I felt it would be useful to provide an example from my own experience. So this project had NHS ethics for the participation part of the research, and it was a funded research project which had a PPI group, and we were interested in evaluating and capturing the impact of the PPI in the project. So there was a separate subgroup set up which consisted of the researchers, the PPI leads, and public contributors. And then I didn't hear anything about this for a while, and it was announced at a general PPI meeting that we could begin work on the evaluation and impact of the patient public involvement. We could start because ethics were in place. But the public contributor members of the group, including myself, had not been informed about the ethics application or invited to be involved in it. And when I questioned, actually, why do we need this? I was told it was an institutional requirement in case we wanted to publish about this aspect of the PPI. Next slide, please. So I want you to think about these issues from your perspective through the lens of our findings. So responsibility. Who took responsibility for this, and was it discussed and shared amongst the team? Processes. Is this scenario what the research ethics process is designed for? Or this is a tick box exercise to protect the academic institution? Inconsistency. Was the patient public involvement in this project being conflated with participation in research? Would your institution require you to do this? And power. Who held the power in this scenario? And actually, you know, the knock-on effect was that I'm not sure if I want to be involved in this project going on, because it, you know, that made me feel pretty crap, actually, for want of a better word. So next slide, please. So just a summary and some reflections. So there is a saying that co-production is a state of being, the values and principles that you inhabit, the way that you are not doing. And it's the values and principles that you inhabit and guide your actions. And arguably the concentration at the moment on research ethics is on the doing and getting ethics, not the being. So why do so many academic institutions require ethical approval for co-production and PPI, conflating these with participation in research? And when we think about why we have the Declaration of Helsinki, are we disrespecting the experiences of the people involved, you know, that participated in the things like the Tuskegee study without their consent? You know, are we disrespecting them by conflating patient public involvement and co-production with research participation? You know, so we need to have a focus on relationship building and power dynamics, and this should be a key component of collaborative research. And surely ethics review should help and not hinder that process. What mechanisms do we have for discussing the broader ethical issues outside of ethics committees, as they may not be equipped to do this? You know, and I think the ethics need to be done with public contributors and co-producers, not to them. And I want to leave you with a final provocation. is the process of gaining ethical approval all about institutional arse covering when it comes to co-production and patient public involvement? Thank you.